So we are gathered here on this amazing occasion in this lovely venue to celebrate the fact that we've got Cyrus with us, who is, I have to say, not just a Southampton treasure, but a national treasure, an international treasure, and a giant upon whose shoulders many of you have stood. So it is, and I'm not going to carry on for any time at all. I don't think I need to extol Cyrus's excellences and virtues, but it is just a huge pleasure, I think, for all of us, I think I speak on behalf of everybody, to be here with Cyrus to hear a little bit of a journey, I think, through your amazing life. So thank you, Cyrus.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's just, I can't tell you how lovely it is for me to be here with you tonight. After the journey that I've had over the last sort of couple of years, I really was not sure I would be able to have one last go to meet with people that I've loved so much and worked with so long over the years. And tonight is it, and I am so grateful that you've all been able to take the time to come and join us this evening. So it's a journey into the epidemiology, prevention and treatment of osteoporosis, and it's my farewell lecture at the University of Southampton. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor of Rheumatology and Director of the MRC Life Course. Anyway, the rest, as they say, is for the next slide. And my journey was really around the prevention of osteoporotic fractures throughout the life course. And all I'm going to cover in brief is three aspects of that. One, the descriptive epidemiology of osteoporotic fracture, and second, divided into two, preventive strategies against osteoporosis. And because we're always a diverse audience in this sort of setting, I thought I'd cover prevention in later life, just on the salience of primary and secondary prevention, and prevention during development, using as the metaphor antenatal vitamin D supplementation to improve the bone mass of the offspring. And all of my research work, starting way back before this building was not modernised, was at the MRC Life Course Epidemiology Unit, that in its earlier days was known as the MRC Environmental Epidemiology Unit. And I'll talk to you about the history of the unit and the faculty and the University Hospitals NHS Trust in a moment. But from about 1908, I also developed a fledgling group at the Institute of Musculoskeletal Science at the University of Oxford, and the groups together have made progress in osteoporosis over that whole time. So just a few biographical details. So this slide always receives some mirth because of the way in which my mum and dad look at that time. I, of course, am completely in tune with Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, which is the backdrop there, in 1977, which is where I did my preclinical, and I then went to the Royal and Ancient St Bartholomew's Hospital to do my clinical. I was born, for those of you that aren't aware, in Dar es Salaam, haven of peace, on the east coast of Tanzania. At that time it was called Tanganyika, because Zanzibar, where Freddie was born, was across the channel. And mum and dad were both physicians from Bombay. So we trod a familiar path of West Coast Indian families who went to East Africa, and then at the time of the obtaining of independence moved to either back to India or to the UK. And my mum and dad moved to the UK, and I was educated for secondary school at Christ College, Finchley, which I hadn't known until just recently when one of the presidents of the BMA, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, was showing some biographical material of his at a similar sort of lecture, and one of his old slides showed his blazer. And his blazer was my blazer, and he went to exactly the same school in North London, and I just was separated by a year or two. The general. So the old workhouse hospital, shown here in this middle panel, was incepted from 1902, although some parts of it were from well before that time. But of course the modern era was when we decided to have a medical school within the University of Southampton. And this picture here represents the clearance work that had the parts of East Wing, subsequently West Wing and Centre Block, with the old Lower Shirley and Portswood wards, where I'm sure some of you, I can look around, particularly in the fronter rows, will have had patients, as we did in those late 70s and early 80s. And of course, this is the thing now. There's hardly a square metre. There's certainly no parking anywhere between here and God knows Rownhams, I suppose. And we are a wonderful laboratory for medicine, for science, and a laboratory for teaching. The unit started off life as a building with stilts. And I'm proud to say that the unit director's car parking space in any pictures that I've been able to locate has always been empty. So at the time when I first joined the unit, it was on stilts, so you could park underneath. And we didn't have our top floor and all of the attendant problems that Nick has had to deal with over the last year, correcting some of the rather remedial estates work that we took on in the 25 years previously. The first director of the unit was Sir Donald Atchison, a remarkable man. I'll tell you about him a little bit in the next slide. But the second director was David Barker. And David and Jan were really... David was my mentor. I was his registrar when I arrived at the Royal South Hants and went into epidemiology and worked on osteoporosis, largely because of David's direction. And then the last part brings us up to date with the other major funder in the UK to the Research Council's funding stream and the charities, the NIHR. And we're proud to be part of a large and growing NIHR biomedical research centre. And again, one or two people in this room will remember the beginning of that journey when we actually pipped at Oxford to win a grant to build the original Wellcome Trust Clinical Research Facility that started the move towards us being a premier research site for translational research on the South Coast. So the unit was really a reflection of MRC, intramural investment at the University of Southampton. It has been continuous since 1979, which is pretty enviable for one that is not a member of the top 5 medical faculties. So Donald was the founding director, remarkable man. Came to Oxford by the Sea, as it was known in those days, together with Jack Howell and Ralph Wright, and was the founding dean. He was also the chair of the District Health Authority, and he had a strong research track record on occupational cancer. And David, who's one of Donald's original fellows, is in the audience today. David worked with Donald on occupational cancer and continued to do so for much of his professional career since that time. But Donald was summoned to greater things. He became the chief medical officer in 1983, and David took over in that year until 2002. Sorry, there's a typo there. 2002. And David spawned the developmental origins hypothesis, principally looking at cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. I took over from David in 2003, and I was forged. Joe from MRC will not know the complete story, Mick will know more of it, but through a variety of name changes, which ended up with 2 units out of 1, which is not something that happens that often in MRC terms, but we ended up with an MRC Life Course Epidemiology unit, and I was basically running that over a period of about 20 years. And most important of all in this slide, the future. And I'm so pleased because as recently as last August, I was not sure what would happen about the future of the MRC LEU beyond my time when I'd got ill. And I'm so pleased that the MRC and the university have come together so joyfully in getting together all of the necessary background work, holding the interviews, and I'm delighted that Nicholas Harvey will be succeeding me from a week's time as the director of the MRC Life Force Epidemiology Unit or Centre thereafter. And I really look forward, and we'll tell you a little bit at the end about Nick's direction of travel as we move forward. So my story is really pretty simple. Our current strategic objective is a reduction of musculoskeletal disability by intervention across the life course, but my work really was about osteoporosis. It's sarcopenia, the commonest joint disorder in Western populations, and osteoarthritis, the commonest, sarcopenia, the commonest muscle disorder, osteoarthritis, the commonest joint disorder, that are the subjects of others within the team, led by Nick as we move forward, but mine has really been osteoporosis. And we've basically attempted to develop life course models for the disorder, aiming to intervene, both with lifestyle and pharmacological therapy. And lest you worry that this is an important area, in the Global Burden of Disease in 2017, musculoskeletal disease and psychological disease were the 2 largest growth areas over the next 40 years, and that increase is going to take the form of around 40% gains in loss of disability. I'm going to spatter through this talk some reflections of what it's been like as a person involved in science. So, a few pieces of advice to younger scientists. The first, reflect on your choice of research topic and take advice. Is the subject important and relevant? So here is Alice. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? And the Cheshire Cat says, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. The next is to stand properly on the shoulders of giants. Read what people say before you enter the field. Work out what the thought processes were about your chosen area of expertise so that you can follow a line that you go on to. In osteoporosis, this was very simple. It went up for 3 million years. And we're able to record Hippocrates' writings showing osteoporotic fractures. We see Saxon barrows. This is a burial site in Wales that had a Saxon tomb that clearly show osteoporosis in the vertebral fracture, in the vertebral body. And we coined the term osteoporosis in 1850. It was orthopedic surgeons and pathologists who pointed to the rarefaction of the central part of the trabecular body and thought that that might be because of loss of bone density in the vertebrae. There was a pause in which we went in a large circumvention looking at the menopause between the 1940s and the end of the 1990s, and that has come back again with an interest in menopausal hormone therapy now. But the real pause in that era was the ability to measure non-invasively bone density. And it's that, with culmination in 1987 in densitometry through DXA, that has led to the news attendus of osteoporosis subsequent to 1990, with a number of drugs, algorithms for care, and risk assessment tools. So from being an inevitable consequence of aging, with no real definite definition, to being one in which we can risk assess and treat a disorder. So when I started in 1983, it was just a verbal definition, a disorder characterized by low bone mass and microarchitectural deterioration of bone tissue, leading to an increased risk of fracture. I went in 1983 to the Epidemiology for Clinicians course, and the last version of this course to date completed about a month ago, perhaps 3 weeks ago. So David Barker and Jeffrey Rose set up that course in 1979, once a year, and trained young clinicians and epidemiologists in the tools of their trade. And it's being continued here today, led by Janice Baird, Kumaran, and many members of the team. But on my time, in 83, the question was, is osteoporosis anything to do with the biggest fracture, hip fracture, that's linked to it? And David, together with Paul Dieppe, and I didn't have a photograph of him, but Michael Cawley is here, was also involved in that early work that I did on osteoporosis while I was still at the Royal Southampton as a registrar. We, instead of just comparing people who had fractured according to what their bone density was, or in terms of high or low, we actually looked at people who had fallen and then had a fracture, some of whom had low bone density and some of whom had high bone density. And we therefore eliminated the confounding from falling. And that idea emerged from that 1983 training course in epidemiology. Of course, thereafter, we developed bone densitometry, as I said, and the World Health Organization then had a continuous distribution of bone density against which a definition of osteoporosis could be coined, and the magic number was positioned at 2.5 standard deviations below the young normal mean for bone density. And this group, I was in NAPIGS at that time, but I was still part of this group, was led by the WHO and John Canis, who remains still with René Ritzeli and Jean-Yves Regenster, who are here today, one of our stalwart collaborators over the years. Next, think about learning from other places that do it well. So for me, I wanted to go to osteoporosis research, particularly epidemiology, in the United States. And I was fortunate enough to obtain an MRC travelling fellowship to the Mayo Clinic and to work under Joe Melton and Larry Riggs, who were one of the foremost centres of osteoporosis research at the time. And of course, in Rochester, Minnesota, it's easy to do research because for about 7 months of the year, it looks like this. So you're far better off writing papers than think about what it will look like in summer, because there won't be a summer for very long. And so we worked out the epidemiology of the second fracture, vertebral fracture. We showed how its incidence varied with age, sex, geography, and time. And we showed also how it increased the risk of other fractures and was associated with increased risk of death and disability. So we built together an incidence graph in men and women for the main osteoporosis-related fractures. And the lifetime risk of these fractures is substantial. We learned that this is actually quite a common disorder. In women from the age of 50 onwards, 14% will get a hip fracture, 11% a clinical spine fracture, and 13% a wrist fracture. And men, a substantially lower proportion, but nevertheless significant. That there were huge numbers of fractures each year. Hospitalization was universal for hip fracture, tinier for spine fracture, and in between for wrist fracture. And for hip and spine fracture, there is a 20% impact on survival. And of the 3.5 million osteoporosis-related fractures each year in the European Union, the cost amounts, and I saw James, who I remember coming to an interview not far from here, Raftree, telling me about our health economics, and it figures every now and again in some of the later studies too, is a substantial cost. It's not coronary artery disease, it's not all-cause cancer, but it's certainly similar to osteoarthritis and inflammatory joint disorders. We just repeated last year the follow-up of that European study, and 3.5% of EU healthcare spending was on the disorder, 55.3 billion euros, and more importantly, 25% increases in fracture risk happening between 2019 and 2034 if the current rates are continued. And the last point before we go to the prevention part is the fascinating secular tendency in this disorder. So throughout the period from 1930 to the late 70s or 80s, there was a steep rise in hip fracture incidence over and above age and sex. There was an age-adjusted and gender-adjusted increase in incidence. But then there was a plateau and a decline. And Clive Osmond, who has studied this in great detail in cardiovascular disease, immediately pointed me to the importance of both significant period and birth cohort effects acting on fracture risk. And the importance of that is that you can do a truly life course prevention strategy, where you focus on immediate risk factors early on, and then focus on people in earlier periods of development during which they can also have modification to their fracture risk. Now, the preventive strategies themselves are simple. We either target with a risk factor, for example, bone density, or risk factors and bone density in the FRAX algorithm, and unacceptably target those who are at greatest risk with some kind of pharmacological therapy, or you move the entire distribution in a positive direction. And I'm not going to dwell on this anymore today, but in terms of dietary calcium intake, physical activity, in terms of smoking and alcohol, both of these measures should be undertaken in terms of fracture prevention. So manage your career, differentiate yourself. Originality, diligence, communication, and dedication. Good science is an art to be embraced with passion. Risk assessment and treatment. So, for risk assessment and treatment, the first thing is, did we have any treatments? Well, they came in the period after we developed bone densitometry and became widely popularized over the period from 1990 onwards. We have anti-resorptive agents, bisphosphonates, such as alendronate and risedronate, denosumab, estrogen, selective estrogen receptor modulators. And more recently, we have formation-stimulating agents, including teriparatide and the biosimilars, abaloparatide and romosozumab. How do we use them? To use them, John Keynes and his working group put together a questionnaire including 11 risk factors, which could then be coupled with bone densitometry to derive the 10-year risk of a fracture, of major osteoporotic fracture or a hip fracture. And Nick has currently, together with Eugene McCluskey, spearheaded some of that use of and modification of that fracture risk assessment tool. We, with others, undertook a large pragmatic randomized controlled trial looking at screening of older women with regard to those risk factors and treatment. And those data were published, it was called the SCOOP trial, and were published in Lancet in 2018. It was spearheaded by Lee Shepstone and Eugene McCluskey. Women aged 70 to 85 years from 7 geographic regions of the UK were randomly allocated to treatment with a screening intervention or usual care, the control. Follow-up was for 5 years, and the principal endpoints were osteoporotic fracture, hip fracture, and mortality. And we recruited 6,000 women 70 to 85 in the control arm and 6,000 in the treatment arm. And we measured the outcomes. And there was a striking reduction in hip fracture risk over that 5-year period, with 74% reduction in the screened arm control compared to the control arm, and that being conferred by much better GP prescribing and adherence. You can see there was astonishingly high rate of adherence and medication in the high-risk group of the intervention arm. And on its own, that would have been interesting, but coupled with 2 other studies, one in the Netherlands and the other in Denmark, the meta-analysis showed very clearly that there were significant effects of reasonable size, 0.8 and 0.91, for hip fracture and major osteoporotic fracture. So moving towards treatment targeted in a primary preventive setting is the order of the day for the next phase of that research. Identify problems before they reach you: supervision, funding, research direction, and career options. And never, in my experience, close a door that you don't need to. I've been served well with that adage, and I've not closed many over the years. Some, but not many. Secondary fracture prevention. Again, a brief story of that. We, at the International Osteoporosis Foundation, and as I mentioned, it's great that René and Johnny, colleagues there, are with us today, and Nick is our current chair of the scientific committee of the IOF. About 10 years ago, we put together a Capture the Fracture initiative. This has grown hugely. It's now over 800 fracture liaison services worldwide, over 50 countries, and registering more than 500,000 fractures. Kasim and his colleagues in Oxford have shown, with natural experimental studies that introduction of these fracture liaison services lead to reductions in second fracture occurrences. And so between 2020 and 2023, two corporate partners, Amgen and UCB, the IOF and the universities of Southampton and Oxford, have put together a global policy initiative to support secondary fracture prevention that includes mentorship, policy definition, coalitions between various stakeholders, scalable solutions including a common pathway for attendance, and the cost utility in different countries for different treatments, and a digital tool. And that will undoubtedly improve secondary fracture prevention. So the last part, be prepared to change direction. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. That, of course, is attributed to Charles Darwin and was indeed written to him, but was popularized by a guy called Prof. Leon Megginson, I found out, Professor of Management at LSU. And that change of direction for myself was to look at the earliest stage of life, influenced by David and his colleagues, many of whom are here today. So David will, be an inveterate mapper of disease. He started by looking at the map of coronary artery disease to death rate today, and suspecting that it looked so like the map of neonatal and postneonatal mortality some 70 years earlier. But the tenacity of David was A, his linkage to biology, and B, his understanding of etiology, of causation. And he knew that he had to show these relationships in individuals. And so he went and did that in Hertfordshire, in Sheffield, and in Preston. He showed that the birth weight of individuals related to their likelihood of dying as adults of heart disease. And in those days, in the late 90s and early 2000s, this was thought of as heresy. But David went on and showed that persisting changes in structure and function caused by environmental stimuli at critical periods during early development were indeed sustainable biologically, and by 15 years later, the developmental origins hypothesis was on the front of Time magazine. So the more modern formulation of the life course determinants of health and disease that is currently used is that the young woman's diet, body composition, physical activity, education and lifestyle before and during pregnancy, through developmental plastic responses and epigenetic processes, and worked on by infancy and childhood to set up vulnerability to chronic disease in later life. And for us, that meant antenatal vitamin D status, because that was the single most important determinant of childhood bone mass that we were finding in our cohorts. And probably the most important paper was Qasim Javed's PhD thesis, which was published in The Lancet, looking at maternal 25-hydroxyvitamin D in mid-pregnancy, and showing that it correlated with childhood bone mass some 9 years later. And although the data were in that direction in the body of literature as a whole, it was clear that there was too much uncertainty to move forward on a public health policy without a randomized controlled trial evidence. So if you want to make incremental improvements, be competitive. If you want to make exponential ones, be cooperative. But it's amazing, sorry about that, I don't know where it is. It's amazing what you can achieve if you don't mind who gets the credit. Oops, sorry about that. Oops. never mind. There. So we undertook the Mavidos trial. This was a large randomized controlled trial of vitamin D supplementation during pregnancy, which increased bone mass in winter births by eliminating the steep winter decline in maternal vitamin D status. That trial, that 1,000 women followed through pregnancy, that trial was initially led by Nick Harvey and has now been taken over by Beth Curtis and Becca Moon. It in addition showed that as we continue the children's follow-up, we see increasing evidence of sustained improvement in bone, with the latest data from Beth Curtis showing changes in bone strength at age 4 years of age, despite the vitamin D supplement being discontinued at the end of pregnancy. And we've also shown the mechanisms underpinning this in both the Southampton Women's Survey and the Mavidos trial. It was an epigenetic methylation of the RXA promoter, a way in which the vitamin D pathway is modified by the prevailing vitamin D environment of the mother. So, maternal antenatal vitamin D supplementation with 1,000 units of cholecalciferol daily results in higher offspring bone mass in winter births. The summer to winter decline in maternal vitamin D status is abolished with supplementation. 1,000 units of cholecalciferol daily resulted in vitamin D repletion in over 80% of women, and these findings suggest that a stratified approach to vitamin D supplementation during pregnancy may be warranted. And in the centenary of findings of MRC reports, we were delighted that that particular area of research was highlighted. So, in this discussion of the life course prevention of osteoporotic fracture, the population and individual mortality and morbidity burden attributable to osteoporotic fracture is well established. Non-invasive assessment of bone mineral density and microarchitecture have also been established, and secondary fracture prevention is validated. Risk assessment in later life has been individualized through the FRAX algorithm. Incorporation of such a strategy to target treatment among women aged 70 to 85 years in primary care leads to a 24% reduction in hip fracture incidence. The developmental contribution to osteoporosis, and particularly gestational vitamin D supplementation, influences neonatal and childhood bone mass. And that integrated life course preventive program that we were hoping to put together is now a reality in terms of some of the evidence. So then, where will it go in the next couple of slides as we go forward? So, as I said, the current quinquennium that Nick will be leading had within it his own program on life course epidemiology and prevention on fracture, Elaine Dennison on the osteoarthritis in musculoskeletal aging conundrum, and for Kate Rord, musculoskeletal health in diverse global populations, particularly sub-Saharan and Southeast Asian populations. And then we also have, with Janice Baird, Keith Godfrey, Mary Barker, the body composition and health behaviour section of our work addressing cardiovascular disease, diabetes and obesity. But there's already the shaping of a new way of doing research that moved to collaborative research across the country, and Nick has put together an interdisciplinary collaboration on a national musculoskeletal aging network. Molecule to population, discovery to policy, methods and resources as platforms, ECR and MCR support, and novel research themes. I hope that we are able to witness that for me in the months and years to come, and to lastly say, even when things look down, when they're going down the drain indeed, persevere, because in the end, it's a career in medical research that is a fantastic privilege and a wonderful amount of fun. And the very fact that you joined me today to just have some of that fun means so, so much to me. So the last, of course, is all of my thank yous. And the main thank you, of course, is of the so many people that were former students. They have all, without fail, now been, I have been a person that they learn from. And that has been such a joy. They're there at the senior levels, they're at intermediate levels. But there have been my colleagues as NHS rheumatologists, my colleagues as the senior staff in the MRC LEC, and my colleagues in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Southampton. Of course, the units and their staff are important. Of course, all of the wonderful funding that we've had has been important. Of course, our patrons have been important. But most important of all have been the people that have kept me going for the last couple of months. And Jill has been my eyes, brains and ears, or eyes, ears and brains. And of course, throughout all, Margie has been watching over me, and my two boys, Philip and Charlie, will be with me every day. So thank you very much for sharing your time with me. It's a real indulgence, so I do not take it lightly, and I'm really, really grateful for you to be able to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cyrus, for a wonderful half hour. I just use the microphone there. So before I hand over to Philip White, our Senior VP for Academic, to give the closing remarks, I'll just share a few reflections on what we've heard over the last 30 minutes. And I think this has certainly been a journey, but it's been a journey not just of a career, but of the development of a field, and of really pretty much a complete intertwining of that career with the development of the field. And that's been really apparent over what we've heard, and the breadth of contribution and showing how you really sort out a problem with the epidemiology and then progressing that to the life course approach. And the value that comes from that approach in a wide collaboration, both in terms of the science and that it's an interdisciplinary approach from molecular biology through the epidemiology through to policy, and to taking that forward into clinical practice and population health. So I think the other key area, and this is of course impacts very much at a personal level as well, is what Cyrus has shared about the importance of nurturing the next generation, and so much of us have, so many of us have benefited from that. And I particularly reflect on your advice number 4, learn from the best, which I very much had the privilege of doing, as have so many of us here. And just as an example, Cyrus's mentorship activities have been recognised just a couple of days ago through an award from a new inaugural award from the Bone Research Society as a mentorship award in his name. And when I think back to over the last, more than 20 years or so now, to sitting opposite you in that room in the deanery for the Wessex rheumatology rotation, and you asked me, well, are you interested in doing any research? I thought, gosh, I hadn't really thought about it up to this point, but of course the answer is yes, absolutely. You said do not close doors, and that is so true. So many people have benefited from your advice and your support over so many years. And if you look around, you had some names up there, there's many more around the world who have enjoyed your support and your leadership, your encouragement and friendship over those decades. So thank you. And so just before handing over, I'll just say a final thank you so much to Cyrus for all of your support and friendship over the years. Wish you, Philip, Charlie and the family all the very best in this next phase. And just a final round of applause. Thank you.
I'm acutely aware that I'm all that's standing between you and some more drinks outside, so I'll be really quick. So I'm Phil Wright, I'm the Senior Vice President Academic at the University of Southampton, and it's really my privilege to close the proceedings this afternoon. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating talk, Cyrus, and I'm a chemical engineer, so this is a very long way from my traditional training, but that was a fascinating talk and really accessible, and I think it was a really fascinating journey about the science and the medicine, but also the career reflections. So thank you very much. I think it's really, really obvious that you're a really world-class. You've got world-class achievements in medicine and medical research. I think that's really, really fantastic. External bodies have measured this, of course. You know, recent report in research.com ranked you number 1 in the UK and number 16 in the world. So that's really, really impressive. So just a little bit of external reference there. So on behalf of the Vice Chancellor and the University Executive Board and the wider university, in addition to the medical work that you've been doing, I'd like to thank you for your many contributions to senior leadership here over a number of years. You're a previous Associate Director of Research. You're the Faculty of Medicine Vice Dean, and you did a lot of work, obviously, in pivotal roles around the REF and QS rankings, etc. And importantly, of course, a key role in our strong relationship with the hospital, being a director on the UHS board. So I think that you've made a lot of really strong contributions across the board, and it just leaves me now to thank you once again personally, but also on behalf of the wider university. Thanks very much, Cyrus. I think I'm right in saying there's more refreshments outside. Is that right? Yep. So please go and continue the conversations. Thank you. That was a really lovely talk. Yeah. I mean, Chandler's forward. It's not moved down. Yeah.